In this episode, philosophy professor Dr. Katarina Stevens explores arguing without being cruel, what morality has to say about how we should give reasons. There are two different things that we can mean when we say that we're arguing with someone. We can mean that we're fighting, or we can mean that we're exchanging reasons in an attempt to justify an opinion or a belief that we have.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to see this talk. Today I want to talk to you about how to argue, and specifically I'm going to take a kind of moral point of view on it, and I'm going to talk about one way that we can argue in ways that are morally questionable, with the kind of suggestion that if we become aware of it, we'll try to avoid it. And so let's first talk a little bit about argumentation, right? We have kind of a really weird relationship to the whole idea of arguing, because on the one hand, we have this kind of ideal version of how an argument could go, that's kind of represented by the scales on that picture there. Right, we kind of imagine that when we argue to resolve an issue, we figure out what the balance of reason tells us we should do or believe. And we kind of imagine we have a magical scale where each arguer can put their reasons and then the scale will tell us what's right. But on the other hand, we also, when we think about having arguments with people, we think about, strife and fighting with words. We think about propaganda and demagogy. So I had a short interview on the radio this morning, and the very first thing that I was asked was kind of, well, we all know arguments. They're horrible. What are we going to do about that? And so we have this kind of weird relationship to argumentation. On the one hand, we imagine it as this kind of way to resolve issues through reasoning, and on the other hand, we think of it as this kind of really dangerous thing that we can engage in, and that is basically strife or fighting with the use of words. Now, real arguments kind of are neither of those extremes, right? Real arguments happen usually somewhere between we actually manage to figure out what the reasons tell us and we are actually just fighting with each other. Because we're humans, we make mistakes, we get carried away by our passions, but we usually are also interested in actually figuring out what reason tells us. Now, the outcome of arguments affect our well-being, because arguments, when we argue with people, that changes what we believe, and it changes the decisions that we make. And we can make good or bad decisions, and we can have true or false beliefs. And having true beliefs is generally thought to be better for a person than having false beliefs, and making just decisions is generally thought to be better than making unjust decisions or unwise decisions. And presumably, when we argue in the sense of fighting with words, right, we are less likely to make good decisions, and presumably the closer we get to actually figuring out what the balance of reason tells us, the more likely it is that we make good decisions and in the end adopt true beliefs. So theoretically, we should then think that we have good moral reasons to strive to argue in a way that's actually going to reflect the balance of reasons in the end. That's kind of what seems to follow, right? So during argument, we should try to behave such that, in the end, we've actually evaluated the reasons and not just fought with each other. And that means we need an ethics of arguing, and it's a good thing that I'm being employed. Right? So one way to kind of approach the questions about the ethics of arguing is by identifying ways that argument can go really wrong and then trying to avoid them. And that's what I want to do with you today. So here's one obvious way to argue in immoral ways. You can just lie, right? You just present something as a reason that isn't actually true. You say, I took the dog out today, so you have to do the dishes. Well, there's obviously a stain on the rug and the dog peed there at 10 o'clock in the morning. No one took the dog out, it's a lie. That's a way to argue immorally. There's another way that's especially fun, is you can just use fallacies. That is, you can use arguments that are really good at persuading people, but that don't represent any reasons at all. So, for example, I could then come to you and say, look, it's a problem that the dog constantly pees on the rug. And if you then, instead of answering right directly towards my claim, say something like, you just say that because you love cats, you horrible cat lover, then you've attacked the person instead of the claim, and this is a fallacy. Right, it doesn't present an actually good reason, but it's very persuasive. People constantly fall for this kind of argument. So these are two ways that we can argue immorally. Why now is this immoral? Well, if we engage in these kinds of deceptions, we present things like as if they are good reasons, but they aren't really. then we knowingly risk that the person we talk to will adopt bad beliefs or make bad decisions, and that will probably negatively impact them, right? They end up having to unjustly walk the dog in the rain. Okay, so even though those two things that I've just talked about aren't usually thought of as moral problems in Logic 1000 or critical thinking introductory courses, right? We've just seen that they are connected to ethics and morality, and they are the kinds of things that we try really hard to address in these kinds of courses. So there's tons of stuff that we talk about these things. We try to get our students to a point where they can recognize fallacies, and when they know that you're not supposed to, well, they probably already know that you're not supposed to lie from their parents. Okay, so what I want to talk to you about today is another less obvious way to behave immorally during an argument, or at least to behave in a way that is negligent and then causes harm that is kind of morally relevant, harm that if we know about it, we want to avoid for moral reasons. So let's look at an argument. Let's imagine one. Let's say, right, you're sitting on the couch and I storm in and I say, I did way more housework than you today, so you have to take the dog out right now. Right? I've presented an argument and we are now in an argument. And there's several different ways that you could answer me. So for example, you could say something along the lines of, no way, you did more housework today, but I've been working harder than you all week, you've been slacking off, I had to do all the cleaning on Saturday, so it's your turn. You could also answer in a different way. You could say something like, yeah, I can see that you did a lot of work today, but I kind of feel like over the week it was even, or maybe I did a little more, but I can't really remember. Can we figure this out together and see who really should take the dog out together? Or you could even say something like, you know what? Please take the dog out today. If you do, I'll do everything tomorrow. Now, what I want you to notice is not just that in each of these responses, the content was kind of different, but also that the responses each started a different kind of argument between us, right? In the first response, you took up the same way that I was speaking, right? You immediately took the opposite position and you presented all the reasons that speak for you don't have to take the dog out. And so we got into this kind of for and against dialogue that in argumentation theory we call a proponent-opponent dialogue. But in the second kind of argument, with your second response, you try to do something different, right? You kind of try to get me on your side, and then we together find all the reasons that are relevant to the dog walking problem, and we together figure out who really should take out the dog. And that's what we call a deliberation. And in the last possible answer you could give, it was different again, right? You didn't talk about the fairness or who should justly take the dog out at all. Instead, you started a negotiation, right? You made an offer and you probably expected that I then make a counter offer or some kind of threat, like if you don't take the dog out, I won't do the dishes, or something along those lines. So we have three different kinds of arguments here. And now, if we're interested in finding out how we should behave so that we get as close as possible to that right balance of reason, figuring out state of behavior, we can ask which of these ways to argue is the best way. Now, we could try and figure this out by kind of looking at the outcomes that are likely for each of these, what we can call dialogue types. So there's 3 dialogue types that we've introduced. And we can use each one of them to figure out who should take the dog out. And but each of them will taking one of them will probably to some degree impact the outcome. And this is because each of them takes different reasons into account. So if we go into the for and against each other proponent-opponent dialogue, we will only consider the conclusions that one of us is kind of representing. And we will only consider the reasons that that each of us can kind of use in order to support what they want to represent. We won't probably come to kind of possible third solutions, like we won't talk about the possibility that we could hire a dog walker, given that we constantly fight about dog walking. If we start a deliberation, that would mean that we just try to get all the reasons that are somehow applicable into one big pool and then figure out what we should do on that basis. If we start a negotiation, our reasoning pool, the pool of reasons that we're going to consider is even smaller than in the proponent-opponent dialogue, because the only reasons we're going to offer to each other are ones that we can kind of couch in the terms of offers, right? I'm willing to do this, that's why you should do that. That is really limited. And so that might make it seem like deliberations are always best. After all, deliberations are the ones that take the most reasons into account. And this is something that some philosophers have said. But, right, human minds are incredibly lazy and have to be motivated a lot to come up with new reasons. And one way to motivate, like, this might be new to you, but we're not the best possible. We're not angels. We get motivated a lot by competition. So the idea that we are pursuing a goal for ourselves against others motivates us. And so we can be better at coming up with reasons when we get to argue against each other, which means that sometimes it might actually be better to have a proponent-opponent dialogue if we want to find out whether a specific claim is true, because that will motivate both arguers to come up with the strongest reasons they can. And in addition to that, sometimes we've already argued or deliberated for a long time, realized we're not coming to any kind of conclusion, and if we continue, we'll just waste time and at some point get exhausted and angry. And then maybe it's best to just figure out a compromise that everybody can live with. So I don't think we can figure out which dialogue type is always best in any context for every situation just by looking at which will generate the best outcomes. That changes from context to context. Now, we don't have to, we will give up eventually. I'm just going to tell you that so you don't get your hopes up. But we can try another way to figure out what the best way might be to argue in each situation. And that is, we can realize that each dialogue type creates different types of roles for the arguers, and these roles can be more or less demanding. Right? So if you want to argue in a proponent-opponent dialogue, then the roles that you will kind of have are the proponent and the opponent roles. And those require of the arguers to take sole responsibility for defending their conclusion. They're not going to get any help unless there's several proponents. And they need to be able to state their arguments clearly, and they need to be able to state them confidently. They need to be able to attack their opponent's arguments obviously, right? By contrast, if you're in a deliberation, all the arguers are pooling their reasons, everybody shares the same interest in getting every reason or every argument to as strong as it possibly can be, and so the obligations are different. Now you have to help each other figure out what it is that everybody's trying to say, because you're trying to get as many reasons into the pool as possible. And then in the negotiation, right, every arguer is again for themselves. So you have the sole responsibility to represent your interests. You have the sole responsibility to come up with the offers that are going to win you the day. Of course, you're not supposed to cheat, but that's what you're supposed to do. And again, we might think that deliberation is best. Here's why. In proponent-opponent dialogues and in negotiations, arguers, first of all, have to be reflectively aware of what their arguments and reasons are. And second of all, they have to be, for this to work, right, for this to actually accomplish the truth, they have to be roughly equally confident. They have to be roughly equally comfortable with attacking each other, with defending their positions. Can we rely on these conditions always being met? Absolutely not, right? So I'm pretty sure that you sometimes form opinions about what the best decision is or what you believe before you would be able to explain to someone else what your reasons are. Reasons can be really complicated, and sometimes your reasons are basically just a feeling in the pit of your stomach, and you would need a 1.5 hour long conversation with your mother to figure out what that actually means. And sometimes you have to engage in some kind of argument about this before you had that long conversation with your mother. In that case, you have a real problem if you get stuck in a proponent-opponent argument that you can't get out of, because you won't be able to get your reasons across. And those reasons will then be lost. As for the having to be able to present your argument with confidence issue, this is also a problem. And it's a problem that was first noticed by feminist argumentation theorists. That's why I'm going to use their example. So I'm going to use the example of arguers that have been socialized in like traditionally feminine roles. But this also goes for people that are just shy or that have ideas about what it means to be polite that include things like the traditional feminine roles. So let's imagine a person who has been socialized in a traditionally feminine way. The way that she has been told what it means to be a polite, nice person means to be agreeable and demure and somewhat submissive, and in general, kind of just what we call nice, right? But the problem is that in order to be arguing adversarially in a proponent-opponent dialogue, you can't be agreeable, and you're not supposed to be demure or submissive. So you're stuck between a rock on one side and a hard place on the other, right? Either you can do what you have been taught is polite behavior, but then you're going to be a bad proponent in this kind of argumentative dialogue, or you can be a good proponent in this argumentative dialogue, but then you're a rude, horrible person from your point of view, the way that you've been taught you should behave. So what happens when you're then forced into a proponent-opponent dialogue? Well, you will either lose the argument because you can't be a good proponent, or you will at least think that you're losing the affection of others. And in fact, right, if this socialization is somewhat in keeping with what your society thinks you should behave, you might in fact lose the affection of others. The problem is that if people dislike you, they stop listening, and you again lose the argument. So you're really stuck here. In other words, if you force someone who's been kind of socialized in into these traditional politeness norms into a proponent-opponent dialogue, they might just have no chance to get their reasons across. They might just not know how to do that. And they lose the argument, and as a result, they adopt false beliefs, or they have to accept bad decisions. They're the one who takes the dog out even though they shouldn't be. And to add insult to injury, right? Everyone around them is like, yeah, they should take the dog out because it was a good argument. They got their chance. It's obviously the right result. And they felt horrible through the whole thing. This is, by the way, one of the things that we mean when they say that someone is denied voice or is silenced in an argument, right? This is one of the ways people can get silenced. It means that even though you can say things, you're invited to say things, the structure of the argument prevents you from actually being heard, from actually getting your reasons across. And we want to avoid this kind of silencing for two reasons. First of all, it reduces the amount of reasons that we will consider for everyone, and so we get further away from our goal of getting to the scale end of the slide that I showed you in the beginning. And second, it's humiliating to the silenced person because she was taught that we're gonna decide this issue by taking everyone's reasons into account, and then she experiences that's not actually gonna happen because she can't actually make her reasons heard at all. So we might think, again, deliberations are best, right? That's where we help each other out. That's where everybody contributes to all the arguments. That's where everybody's nice and cooperative. But, and again, this is something that philosophers have said, but the problem is that silencing an argument doesn't just happen to shy people. It happens when the structure of the argument makes it impossible to get their reasons across, and that happens when you have a bad fit between the characteristics of the context or the person and the structure of the dialogue. And any dialogue type can be a bad fit to the characteristics of some person or some context, right? Just imagine this. Imagine someone has been bullying you at work because they tell you that your hair color implicates that you're not very smart. And so you go and you complain about it, and your boss says, you know what, let's all sit around the table and we'll deliberate over the questions whether A, hair color actually indicates that you're not very smart, and B, whether it would constitute bullying if someone constantly says that. You might just not be able to participate in that deliberation, right? You're humiliated and angry. How are you supposed to help the other person come up with, formulate their arguments for why it is that you're stupid because you have red hair? Right? That's not acceptable. And so any dialogue type in the wrong context can get this silencing thing. You can't participate in that argument. You can't get your reasons across. So generally, we can say that the choice of dialogue type is morally relevant for two reasons. It impacts the outcome of the argument, and it impacts the abilities of the parties to get their reasons heard. And we can conclude that there's no way for us to identify just one way to argue in each context. There is no best way for all situations. So we have kind of moral reasons to aim at designing each argument correctly each time, but that now seems almost impossible. How can we possibly do that? Here's a bad way to try and do it. We'll just pause every time and say, how do you want to do this? Let's figure out what dialogue type would be best. Let's argue this out and we'll come to a conclusion. Here's why that's bad. right? Imagine I want to talk to you about the dog question, and I say, let's say we argue against each other, and you say, I'd rather deliberate, and then I say, why? Prove why deliberation is better, and you stand there again. I don't actually know how to do that, right? So we can recreate the same problem because we have to argue in order to figure out how to argue. And second, it's just completely unrealistic that we would be able to do that. Just think about how often you argue in your day-to-day life, right? So what did I do? How often did I argue today? I did actually argue about who has to take the dog out. This morning I argued with my 1.5-year-old daughter whether it's appropriate to go outside without pants. I argued about philosophy. I argued about the COVID virus. I had probably around 25 arguments, and if each time we had a pre-argument about how to argue, I wouldn't be here. I would probably sit somewhere still, talking to my 1.5-year-old daughter, who doesn't answer those kinds of things. So let's think about, right, when you argued in the past, I bet you can identify times when the arguments you had turned into negotiations, when they turned into deliberations, or when they turned into these proponent-opponent dialogues. But I guess that you don't always know how that came about. Like sometimes we know how that comes about. Sometimes we do some kind of meta talk. We regulate each other. We say, we wanted to have a civilized discussion here. Or don't start playing for the other team. You always get caught up. Stay on our side. And that way we kind of regulate what kind of argument we should have. But most of the time, we really don't do that. It just kind of happens, right? Most of the time, the kind of argument that we're having just arises naturally. So then how can we create arguments that are right for the right context? And more importantly, if this is a moral question, then we want to know who's responsible. And how, if this just arises naturally, can we make one or the other person responsible for it having gone wrong when someone is silenced? So let's look at the mechanism of how arguments turn into deliberations or negotiations or proponent-opponent dialogues. So remember the argument. So I come in, I say, I did way more housework than you did today, so you have to take the dog out. What I did was I immediately took the proponent role, right? The whole thing already with the first argument sounds like an adversarial one against the other thing. Now, why do you recognize that so quickly? You recognize this so quickly because we get socialized into roles all the time. So you are capable of identifying hundreds of roles. When other people take them, you know how you play them. And in addition to that, you also know which roles complement each other because they usually come in sets. So for example, you know what it feels like when someone plays the teacher. And you also know that the way to respond to that without making a ruckus is to play the student, right? You probably at some point when someone told you to sit up straight and eat your dinner, please, have said, you're not my mother, because you recognize that they have taken a role that comes with the behavior and the norms and the goals of being a mother, and that in order for you to fit into that, you would have to accept now being the child, and that's not what anyone likes. So roles are kind of clusters of norms and typical behaviors that we know and recognize and can use in order to get people into these kinds of sets, these play sets, right? Mother and child, teacher and student, proponent, opponent, and two deliberators. So when I came in and said, I did way more housework than you today, so you have to take the dog out, you recognize that I was being assertive. And I was making a statement of reasons and conclusions that's very clear. My tone is non-conciliatory. And I'm appealing to fairness. I'm not making any offers. And that is enough for you to know that this message, this argument, doesn't just tell you something about the dog. It also tells you that I'm taking a proponent role, and I want this to be a proponent-opponent dialogue. So we figure out the argument type that we're having through the way we design our arguments, our messages. A message that fits a proponent role is not just a message about who has to take the dog out, it's also a message about what kind of argument I invite you into, right, to take the complementary role for. So when you then say something like the first response that I suggested, you say, no way, you were slacking off all week, I did all the work on Saturday, it's your turn with the dog, right? Then what we actually have here is a disagreement on one level about the dog and an agreement on another level about how we're going to resolve this issue with the dog. So if the person that you are arguing with answers you with a message that fits the complementary role to the one you took, then you have a kind of unspoken understanding. And this is really good, because now both of you can rely on the norms that you know about this way of arguing, right? You know what it means to have won in this kind of situation. You know what it means that the argument is over in this kind of situation, and you can settle into this. Usually, we will take the argumentative roads that fit us best. I don't want to take the dog out, and I know why I don't want to take the dog out, and I know how I can try and convince you that I shouldn't have to take the dog out, so I want to do this in a proponent-opponent dialogue. I have absolutely no interest helping you coming up with reasons for why I should take the dog out, and that's why I start with that message. If, on the other hand, right, I was doubtful about dog duties, I might start with a different message because that fits my goals. I might actually want to figure out what's the fairest thing to do about the dog. And then I might start with a different message. So often it's totally fine to just start with the kind of role that you want to take. But as we have already discussed and seen, dialogue types can be harmful because they can silence the other arguer, and they can be harmful because they're not the right kinds of dialogue types for us to get the amount of reasons that we need. So what I want to argue now is that while we choose the argument type together in this kind of cooperative way through our message design with these messages that underlie what we actually say, the arguer that has more power in general in the relationship between the two arguers, even outside the argument, is also the one with the greater ability to choose how the argument is going to go. And as we know from Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility, right? The more powerful arguer, the one who can actually choose, has the moral responsibility to make sure that the person they're talking to can at least get their reasons across. So let's say you don't want to play the opponent to my proponent. You don't want to have a proponent-opponent dialogue. And so when I say I did way more housework now, you have to take the dog out, you answer with the second option, right? You say, can't we just kind of, I don't remember who did what, can we figure out, like, can we tell you this and figure out who really should do it? That answer does not, like, it's, right, it looks more cooperative because the dialogue type you're inviting is more cooperative. But really, now we have two disagreements instead of just one, right? We have a disagreement about the dog, but we also have a disagreement about how we're going to resolve the dog issue. Now, there's still a chance that this can go over smoothly. Namely, I can now just change gears, give in, say, yeah, let's get a piece of paper and write this down, figure it out, and then we have reestablished agreement. But let's say I'm not doing this. Instead, I say, you're just trying to trick me. You cannot give me a good reason for why you shouldn't take the dog out, and if you can't give me a good reason, that's your problem, right? Now this disagreement about how we're going to argue is acute, and it will impact the resolution of the dog walking. And so we have high stakes. Unjust dog walking is at stake. And now you have three options. You can continue to talk as if you were a deliberator. That is, you help me coming up with my reasons, and then you offer what you can offer, and you hope that I help in return. You can engage in what we call meta-dialogue, as in you can address the issue that's the elephant in the room. You can just say, why are you being like this? Like, I'm trying to do this nicely, and you are being so adversarial here. Or you can just give up and try to play along and do this in the opponent role. Can any of this be successful? Well, in order to evaluate this, now we have to talk about the impact of power in this whole thing. So let's talk about power. Here are kind of relevant ways that one arguer can be more powerful than the other in shaping the kind of argument that you have. First of all, it could be that I can live with the dog being unhappy and you can't. So you really need this argument to work, and I don't. I'm totally fine if this whole thing falls apart and we sit in opposite ends of the room crying and the dog doesn't get taken out, but you're not. You need this to be resolved, which we call, I have the better exit options, right? If the thing falls apart, I'm fine and you're not. And so you have to make this work somehow, and I don't. Another way that I can have more power is, I don't care what you think about me after the argument is over, but you care what I think about you. So this is something that students sometimes encounter, right? A student who's arguing with a professor, there's very different other goals going around the argument that impact how much the student dares to do, right? The student thinks it's very important that this professor keeps having a good opinion of me while the professor is tenured. Though, to be quite honest, we really care too. Okay. So, right, there can be these power differences that give one an upper hand in pushing it further and trying to get the argument type they want, even if that might lead to strife. Important is power dynamics are really complex. So if you want to be a good moral arguer, don't try to rely just on kind of rules, like students are always the less powerful, or people that have been socialized in feminine roles are always the less powerful. These are good heuristics, but really, right, the more close the relationships are with the person you're arguing with, and the more complex the situation is, the more complex it can become who's actually in the more powerful position. And so if you want to be a good, nice moral arguer, ask yourself every time, seriously, am I maybe the one who's more powerful here? So let's say you have less power than I do. I'm cold-hearted, I don't care if the dog suffers, but you do. If you continue as a deliberator, you're going to lose the argument. And this is because I have more power to say what counts as winning the argument, right? I can, even if you continue deliberating, you won't get it pushed through that we now evaluate the outcome of the argument as we would in a deliberation. I will push through that we evaluate it as we would in a proponent-opponent dialogue. And given that you helped me with my reasons the whole time, chances of you winning this thing are pretty low because I refuse to do that. If you are in a less powerful position, engaging in meta-dialogue that is opening yet another argument and bringing it to my obvious attention that you disagree with me about the way that I have been conducting myself is really risky. People get pretty upset when they're being told that the way that they've behaved isn't acceptable, and that might make them not want to continue the argument, and then the doc is unhappy, or they might just start yelling at you and then you're unhappy. So the meta-dialogue thing is much easier to do if you're in the already more powerful position, because then the person that you are forcing to talk about the kind of argument you're having has more interest in keeping you happy. Whether giving up and just taking the opponent role will work depends on why you didn't want to have a proponent-opponent dialogue in the first place. Why did you want to deliberate, right? If you just wanted to deliberate because you think that's nicer, you might be able to change gears and go into the opponent role and win the argument that way. But if you did it because you can't argue that way, because it will silence you, then having to play the opponent role because I refuse a deliberation means you're going to lose the argument and be humiliated in the process. And by the way, this doesn't just happen when the more powerful person wants the proponent-opponent adversarial dialogue and the less powerful person wants the deliberation. Right? Just remember back to that situation where you are supposed to deliberate with the person who was bullying you about your hair color. Right? You can turn that around too. So let's imagine that they have been talking to you about why it might be true that, like, telling you that you're not especially intelligent because your hair is red would be, harassment. And then they turn around and say, so now let's talk about my reason. You help me come up with all the reasons for why you might be less intelligent because of your hair color. And then you answer, you can't really expect me to help you find reasons for my inherent inferiority. And the answer is something like, frankly, your hostile attitude shows that you can't be argued with. We've tried, and, innocent until proven guilty. Unfortunately, because you're such a hostile adversarial person, we have proven that I didn't do anything wrong. So this can happen too when people that really can't deliberate are forced into deliberations. So what does all of this show us? The more powerful person, the one with the better exit options, the higher social standing, the one that doesn't care so much about what the other one will think about them, or who doesn't have to care about what the other one will think about them, has more power to determine the kind of argument that you will have. They can just insist. And the less powerful person, if they cannot make their reasons heard in the argument that the more powerful person has chosen, can suffer pretty real relevant harms. In our example, it's just unjust dog walking, right? But arguments sometimes happen for more important reasons than dog walking. Therefore, the more powerful person has a moral responsibility not to choose argument types such that the less powerful person can't make their reasons heard. Right? You're not supposed to choose a kind of dialogue in which you know you will win because the other one won't even get across what they're trying to say. Or in other words, I should probably agree to deliberate about the dog. That's the happy ending we were looking for. Thank you very much.
So I have a question to start, Dr. Stevens. Um, One of the big, I'm going to just dive in. Why not? Because one of the big discussions and things that people are debating about and arguing about right now are things like COVID and vaccines. What are the conversations that you're having in the classroom with students? Are they raising this when you're talking about arguments and different types of arguments and how to approach these things?
Oh, about discussions about COVID or about arguing? Sorry.
Well, I mean, I think that as you're talking about arguing, if you're using examples, I would think that one of the most common examples that might be present in the classroom at the moment might be things around, like, the very sort of controversial issues around things like masking and
Yeah.
vaccination and that sort of thing. Is that coming up in the classroom a lot?
So no, it turns out that Lethbridge students are extremely agreeable and they are really responsible when it comes to masks and all those kinds of things. But we have had talks about what to do when you are arguing with someone who has opinions that you consider so controversial that they might be offensive, right? There's this way that when we have arguments, there's arguments that we have with people where we're like, okay, that person is reasonable. This is a reasonable disagreement. I can kind of respect the opinion that they have. And then it's relatively easy to try and keep the argument civil. It's easy to try and make sure that you understand what the other one is saying. It's relatively, right, because you are already in a cooperative mindset. While it's much, much harder if you try to engage with someone whose opinion to you is offensive. And I think so. There's a kind of difficult balance act here between, because what you have to do is you have to figure out whether the person that you're engaging with is honestly trying to argue with you, or whether you're being trolled. And this is true independent from what side you're coming, right? On any controversial issues. So there's usually idiots on both sides, which means that if you are on one side of a controversial issue, there's a danger that someone is trying to engage you in argument, and they're not being sincere. Their goal is not to kind of get new insights or figure out what really should be believed or done. Their goal is to kind of get at you emotionally or make you mad or make you look bad. But if you realize that the person that you're dealing with is actually interested in arguing with you, and that is whether it is in a proponent-opponent style, which often is much easier when it comes to topics that are controversial, right? When it comes to topics that are really close to our hearts and are really controversial, it's often really hard to try a deliberation because it's really hard for us to detach from our emotions. So it can be much easier and more productive to argue in a proponent-opponent style. So even those can be really cooperative, and you can kind of try and manage those in a way that allows the person that you're talking to get your reasons across. And when you realize that the person you're talking to actually wants to argue with you, right? The goal is not to make you upset. Then you should do that. Then these moral constraints apply to you. And what I didn't get into in this talk is, right, obviously, even a proponent-opponent argument, right? That's a big type of argument. You can have those with more hostility or with less hostility. And you can interrupt a proponent-opponent dialogue in order to have some kind of talk about what they're really feeling. So you can say, okay, it looks like we've been arguing against each other here, and it looks like you're getting really upset, and you're trying to get something across that I just don't understand. Let's stop this for now and try to figure out what it is that you're trying to say, and then we'll return to the argument afterwards. And all these things are appropriate and necessary when you're dealing with someone who's sincere in their attempt to argue with you. I don't know if that helps. Does that help?
Yes, it does. That's great. Thank you. I have had a whole number of questions roll in, so I'm going to dive into those. Jody asks, once the stakes are set, how does the less powerful person get out of the argument that is already set up against them?
Good. So I think I'm a strong believer in the permissibility of civil disobedience during arguments. So there's ways to attempt to change the argument, right? First of all, there's always the way to engage kind of in meta talk, to say something like, look, I think you're misinterpreting me, and I think you're not paying enough attention to what I'm trying to say. Can we just kind of slow down and do this slower, and can you just try and listen first? So there's ways to try and kind of slow things down. But if those things don't work and you realize that you are in the less powerful position, so this might be controversial, but I constantly think about in terms of dog walking and dishwashing and the arguments I have with people that are really close to me. At some point, it's fine to just start a fight. At some point, it's acceptable to see that this argument is the game is rigged, the thing is set up against me, so I'm going to rip it apart. That's at least then what you're dealing with is at least honest violence, like aggressive aggression, and not passive aggression that's also going to make you look like you rightfully lost a fair argument that wasn't fair to start with. So I think that is acceptable sometimes. While I say that, I should add that you can be in such a non-powerful position that that's not an option, and you will just be stuck there. And those situations are tragic and horrible, and they come very close to oppression, right? And, people can oppress each other in private contexts. Oppression is not just a big political thing. And then a moral harm is done, and you might just be in a position where you can't help yourself. But if you can help yourself, if the argument is rigged against you, at some point, if you tried to make it fair again and it doesn't work and the other one is not cooperating, it's sometimes fine to just start a fight and blow the whole thing up. Sorry, I know that sounds a little mean.
Thanks, that's great. Jason Cooper asks, I feel like a lot of this boils down to determining who has more power in a situation. Given the variety of ways in which one can have power, any suggestions on how to resolve that in the context of an argument?
So, right, this is difficult. I mean, you knew that this was difficult when you asked the question. The problem is, so in some contexts, when you're close to the person and you have a lot of trust between you, you can actually address it just directly. You can just say, look, I'm really in a bind here. I don't know how to answer. I don't know how to do this. I don't want the dog to suffer, but I also can't argue with you like this. That you can do when there's a lot of trust between you. But often you just can't address this at all. So in argumentation, and I think this is one of the reasons why people have this kind of split relationship with arguing, that on the one hand, it's this best way to resolve issues, and on the other hand, it's this thing that you should fear and avoid because it's going to lead to strife and stress. One of those reasons is because you can come into these situations where really you don't have an actual option to make it better. The one thing that, an ethicist can tell you is, be on the lookout for when you are the more powerful person, right? This is something that is often very hard for us to recognize. It's often easier for us to recognize the ways that we are being pummeled and the ways that we are the ones in the less powerful positions. That is relatively easy to recognize because it hurts. When we're in the more powerful positions, things seem to just be easy. They seem to just be going our way. So if you kind of want to know how to make the world a better place, right, take a look in the mirror and make it, sorry, now I'm in the song. But yeah, kind of be on the lookout for where and how much power you have to change the situation. And then use it to change it to a point where everybody can get their reasons across. And notice that I'm not even saying get to the point where everybody can get their reasons across best. Like right? It's just some kind of liberal do no harm principle. Like make sure that at least people can get heard, that no one is completely voiceless and doesn't get to say or isn't able to get their things across at all. If someone's sitting in the corner crying because they have tried to say something 3 times and no one listened, maybe at that point that's a hint that things are not going well. I don't know, I hope that helped.
Yes, Jason has noted, thank you. That was really helpful suggestion. Zain Ahmed asks, is it not also important, especially as the more powerful person in the argument, so I think what you've just been referring to, but maybe you want to consider this even further, to consider the psychology of the situation. So for example, sometimes the initiator of an argument may just want their frustrations to be heard, or the respondent may have trouble because, understanding what they're saying because of some past hurt or some past something they're bringing back or bringing to the conversation that they're not aware of.
Yes, and this is really, really important. So now I'm kind of regretting that I didn't put the information-seeking dialogue in there with the other three. So there's a lot of possible dialogue types. And one thing that I can add to what I've already said is that sometimes when we start an argument and it all seems to be going fine, right? Everybody seems to be fine, and then you come across a reason. Someone's trying to make an argument. It was fine in the proponent-opponent dialogue until now, and now they just can't get it across. Like, I don't know. We're arguing about what dog, I'm with dogs today. We're arguing about what dog to buy, and I say, I don't want a long-haired dog. And you're like, but why? And I'm like, well, long-haired dogs are just horrible. And I run off crying. And this is a good sign to say, well, you know, now we have to go into a completely different kind of dialogue, because we have to first figure out what the frustration or the hurt is that is going on here. And so at this point, you have to switch dialogues. You have to go into what's called an information-seeking dialogue, which basically just means that you now want information about my state of mind so that this can continue. And then maybe at some point, you figure out that the reason why I'm so upset is because I think if the dog is long-haired, there will be so much dirt, and I'm already upset with you because you never do enough cleaning, or something along those lines. But yes, it's really, really important to keep a close eye on the psychology of things, because arguments deal with disagreements, and disagreements are emotional, and they bring up all kinds of stuff. And in addition to that, right, the reasons that people give have whole clunks of reasons behind them. They're usually like icebergs, where there's all the stuff beneath that might become important. And so yes, it's really, really important to keep an eye on the psychology of the situation, and to ask yourself, is this maybe going deeper than what that person is saying right now? And therefore, do we maybe have to make a switch in dialogue type, at least for a little bit, to first figure out what the reason is that stands behind all of this, so then we can continue with our deliberation or proponent-opponent dialogue, if I can, yeah, thank you, if that's helpful.
Thank you very much. You're making me very proud of the humanities, because this is very much a humanities talk, and why humanities are so important to study and understand, and how they're so applicable in our everyday lives. Brad asks, what do you do with a person in power who is deliberate in argument type selection and not following good moral judgment? In other words, they know the right tactical approach to engage with those in less powerful positions.
Well, so sometimes, I mean, I know that I'm making everyone depressed. Sometimes you just suffer, right? Depending on how big the power difference is and why it's there, sometimes there's nothing you can do, because any move to change the thing is too risky. Sometimes just saying the way that you behave is not acceptable is going to get you into so much trouble that you don't dare to say it. So it's kind of, we philosophers always want to give the way out, but sometimes there is none. Sometimes you can't start a fight, and you can't start a meta dialogue, and you can't get them to change gears, and you have to have the argument resolved, and now you're just stuck. That happens. But depending on how good an arguer you are, if it's really that unfair situation, well, engage any fallacy you can, right? The game is rigged anyways. The argument won't lead to a valid conclusion. It's rigged against you. So use the ad hominems that you have. Maybe I should be more of a pacifist, but depending on why this is happening, do that. But if you think that it's possible to rescue this, right? As I said, what you're doing when you do that, when you start using fallacies to get yourself out of a bad situation, you're moving the argument further in the direction of this is just rhetoric, and this is just propaganda, and this is just fighting with words. And thereby you make it extremely unlikely that you're going to get to true conclusions or good decisions. Sometimes you have to do that, because if you don't, the bad decisions are going to be absolutely against you, and you're already in a horrible position. And then, sometimes you just throw a punch. That's how life is. Fortunately, not often for me, because I'm very weak. But in any case, if you can somehow get it back to where you're actually reasoning with each other, try that. Right? It's hard to determine, but sometimes the only two options are to suffer it or to use any mean trick in the book. And sometimes you have to use any mean trick in the book. But be aware that the outcome of that is not a true conclusion, and it's not a good decision. It's just you having saved your skin. I don't know if that helps.
Yes, thank you. Brendan asks, if someone is less powerful but inherently more disagreeable, when does the dial of moral responsibility shift to that person?
Okay, that's good. So sometimes being disagreeable is a form of power. So that's what I meant when I said be aware not to think that figuring out who's more powerful is going to be an easy task, right? You can have, so imagine you have an employee and a boss and they're arguing, and usually you would assume that the boss is in the more powerful position. That's a good heuristic to take, right? Normally that's the case. But these two have a history. The boss is a kind-hearted, soft person, and they really don't like disagreement, and they really don't like emotional strife, and the employee has absolutely no problem with this, right? The power dynamic can shift. This can happen. The fact that you are disagreeable and deal really well with adversarial situations is a thing that gives you some power. The question, obviously, is whether it gives you more power than the person you're arguing with. But it is a factor that gives you power because it means you can deal with a fight. You can deal with the idea that the argument might turn ugly and it won't hurt you as much. And the fact that you can do that means that you can take risks in pushing the way that you want to argue more than the other person. Right? That's what I meant when I said it's complicated to figure out who has more power. All kinds of things play into this. And but we are incredibly good at figuring out social positions. Like, we learn this in high school, and it really turns ugly there. And then we know, right? Most of the time, you have a pretty good feeling for where you stand in the social hierarchy in the room. And denying that sometimes becomes a tool to gain advantage. The moral thing to do is to be honest with yourself. So the fact that you can deal really well with disagreement is a bit of power. And it is something that you should put on the scale in favor of maybe I'm the one who should be looking out to not make this miserable. I don't know if that helps.
Thank you. That's great. These are really great questions. I love them. And so if we're going back to the boss sort of employee analogy, there's another question here from Angela, and she asks, would it be a good strategy as a manager who is implementing a change to deliberate so that the employees would feel more invested in the decision making, in a way helping them to come to the right conclusion? Also, feels like it might be kinder to deliberate with the staff so that the power balance isn't skewed further.
Yes. So in general, and again, this is really context dependent. So this is like a rule of thumb that can go wrong all the time. But in general, when you have large power differentials, deliberating together is less likely to put someone up against the wall. Now, however, there's one thing you said, which is deliberate with them so that they see the right conclusion. Now, this is suspicious, isn't it? Because if you already know what the right conclusion is, and you are deliberating so that they see the right conclusion, are you actually deliberating with them, or are you trying to do a proponent-opponent dialogue that they don't recognize so that they're more likely to believe what you're saying? And that's deception, right? Sorry that I'm being harsh, I feel bad. But right, pretending like you're deliberating with someone, but secretly only ever giving the reasons that are in your favor is a deception. When you deliberate, you have to actually help develop the reasons that are against your favor. When you invite people into a deliberation, they believe that everybody's going to help everyone, which means they will help you develop your argument, and they will think that you reciprocate. If in reality all you're trying to do is kind of carefully goad them into the direction you want them in, then you will not actually help them get their reasons to the strongest point. Rather, you will try and keep up the facade of that while pushing your reasons further. So what you're doing is the pretense of a deliberation with an actual proponent-opponent dialogue that they can't play the role correctly in because they don't even know what's happening. And that's not okay. That's a deceptive way to go about this. And if they figure that out, they will be very resentful. People have a radar for these things and they get pretty mad. But in general, right, if you're really willing, if you're really willing to listen to the reasons that other people have, if you're really willing to help them develop their reasons and figure out what's true, if the power differentials are large, it is often good to try a deliberation because it will make it less easy for someone to feel that their back is against the wall. I hope that's an okay answer. I'm sorry for going so negative there at the moment.
Thanks very much. That's great. There's quite a number of questions about COVID and vaccinations and debates. But Lara, who I believe is coming to us from Nova Scotia, has asked a question in a really interesting way. And so I think maybe that I'll let this stand for most of the COVID questions. So she says, "Hi, Kat, thank you for the excellent talk. Related to what you had said in response to my earlier question, what does your work suggest we do when we are not necessarily in an epistemic position to evaluate reasons? So for example, many controversial beliefs are formed according to social networks, and I put my trust in my social counterparts to deliver reliable information to me. If I engage in argument, for example, about vaccine efficiency, as an individual, I'm not necessarily competent to evaluate reasons for or against vaccination. So maybe saying, you're not an expert in, virology, or something like that. How are we to constructively engage in those conversations?"
That's a really good question. So in general, right, if you think about what you would know, if you would have to figure everything you can call knowledge out yourself. I would know a little bit about my family, a little bit about how my roses are doing that are currently being attacked by aphids, but I wouldn't actually know anything about COVID. In fact, I wouldn't actually know whether China is a real place because I haven't ever been there. I just trust experts to tell me about it, right? So our knowledge is extremely dependent on what others can tell us. 90% of what we think we know because others have told us and we trust them. And how do we evaluate this? Well, we evaluate this because we learn strategies to recognize a trustworthy informer, right? We learn things like a trustworthy informer has a degree from an accredited institution. This is an advertisement break. Right? A trustworthy informer has publications in good journals. A trustworthy informer about COVID is probably someone who is kind of in keeping with the scientific consensus. Often we've learned stuff about how science works, right? So we have some kind of background knowledge about roughly why science is trustworthy and roughly why, hand reading isn't trustworthy. And so if we have to engage with people about these kinds of topics where our knowledge doesn't come from us evaluating the evidence ourselves, but rather from us evaluating the people that have evaluated the evidence for us, the most honest thing we can do is engage with them in an argument about what sources we should trust and why the sources that we have chosen are the more trustworthy ones. And there you probably actually do have some knowledge, right? Because you probably actually have made up your mind for why you should trust the scientific consensus, right? Those things you can actually give arguments about. Even if you don't know much about virology, you know why you think that doctors are trustworthy and you know why you think that scientists are trustworthy, and you can engage in that argument. And that's actually more honest than trying to pretend like you understand something that you actually don't. And it's not shameful because there's not a single person on this world who actually understands everything they claim knowledge of. That would be impossible. I hope that helps somewhat.
Thank you. So Michael asks, what about the obligation or possibility of playing devil's advocate? So if I'm in a weaker position, couldn't I just say that and ask you to play out my side of the argument? That's an interesting question.
If you think that I'll do it. So devil's advocates can be really helpful and really important. First of all, because as I think I mentioned this earlier in the talk, I mentioned that our brains are not actually made to find reasons in all directions. So if we can trust cognitive scientists, then our brains are actually made to find reasons for conclusions that we want to convince others of. We're much, much better at finding reasons for things that we already believe than we are at finding reasons for things that we don't believe. And so it is generally much easier for us to evaluate a claim if we have someone whom we can argue against. especially someone who is at least play invested, so pretend invested in winning the argument against it, because that person then has their brain kind of operates towards finding reasons against what we want to say, and our brain operates towards finding reasons for what we want to say, and then we have better chances at evaluating all the reasons that are applicable. This is one big positive of the adversarial proponent-opponent dialogue, and so playing devil's advocate can be really helpful. So when I try to make big decisions, I often call my parents. I'm like, tell me why I'm wrong. And then it helps me figuring out whether I should actually do what I want to do. And so if you're arguing with someone, or if you're dealing with someone who is going to be willing to play the devil's advocate for you, that's great. If you're dealing with someone who's willing to kind of play the devil's advocate against themselves and just trying to take your role and just trying to develop arguments for you, that's also great. Then you're in a really cooperative situation, and you should use that. In fact, you should use it either way, right? That's how deliberations work best. If you're willing to play the devil's advocate against yourself and help them figure out the reasons for what they think, and the other way around, that's how it will work best. Unfortunately, often when you are in difficult arguments, you're going to find that people are not actually willing to do that. They might pretend to do it, just like you might pretend to be deliberating, but they might not actually put a lot of motivation into it. I know that this is incredibly depressing. I'm sorry.
Thanks very much. So I'm cognizant of the time, and we're starting to get quite late. We're going to take 2 more questions. So one of them, I think, might be kind of connected to what you were just talking about, and that is, how do we think about arguments where one side has no moral constraints? So there is no such thing as cheating. Winning is really everything. Or can you even classify this as an argument?
Yeah. So I think what you're thinking of is what you deal with an arguer who's actually not interested in reasons at all, right? They are really just trying to fight with words against you, and they will use any means to win. Well, right, they are playing at argument, or at least at what we generally think of as arguments, right? We generally think, if I offer you an argument, that's at least the pretense of trying to give you a reason. And if we are arguing with each other, that's at least the pretense of figuring out what's right through reasons. And if you know that the other one is actually really only pretending, and they have no interest whatsoever in the truth. And I have to say, be careful, because we often try to convince ourselves that that's what people are doing whom we don't like, in order to justify or rationalize that we can then also behave like that. And that's not okay. And I do that, right? I'm like, you're just trying to bulldoze all over me, and so now I can start a fight, and that's rationalization. And more often than we think, people actually are trying to give reasons. But if you're absolutely sure, well, then the fight is on. Well, because you're not actually in an argument. You're not actually engaged with someone who's trying to give you any reasons. And so you can use whatever methods you need to get out of there, short of, I don't want to be responsible for anyone committing any crimes, but other than that, go ahead.